Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. Hope you are happy and healthy. And happy Chinese New Year to you all. Welcome all of you once again to our second global webinar series for the Rule of Law and Development Program, Row 2020, The Resilient Leader. This program is co-hosted by the Thailand Institute of Justice, or TIJ, and the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School, or IGLP. We are delighted that not only the Row 2020 participants attending this webinar today, but we also invite our Row Fellows and the Emerging Leaders alumni joining from different parts of the world. Thank you so much to you all for your interest in our program. So before we start off our session, please allow me to remind you our house rules. First, please keep your cameras on as much as you can to, maintain our connection. Second, please wear the headset or the small talk device for better sound quality. Third, please turn off your microphones during the webinar, and please rename your Zoom ID to your real name. And as always, if you have any question, any difficulty, please let us know via the Zoom chat. Our team will assist you as soon as possible. สำหรับท่านที่ต้องการรับฟังคำบรรยายเป็นภาษาไทยนะคะสามารถกดปุ่ม Interpretation ที่เมนูด้านล่างของจอ Zoom ของเรานะคะแล้วเลือกเป็นภาษาไทยกดปิดเสียงต้นฉบับที่ Mute Original Audio ได้เลยค่ะ Previously, we had learned from our panelists from the IGLP faculty network who covered the topic of global governance and multilateralism in both general and specific aspects, how it is related to the role of law and the role of the global governance and multilateralism in responding to the global crisis, which is obviously in the pandemic crisis. So it was fantastic that many of you had shared questions and viewpoints during the Q&A session. And we were so sorry that not being able to address them all, but we try our best this time. So to improve our global webinar series today, we decided to extend the Q&A session discussion part while we trying to keep the whole program to end at the same hour. So today we selected an interesting topic for you of the criminal justice reform, which we will see more of the comparative practices and progress in the criminal justice movement in the world. So without further ado, let's begin by welcoming Professor David Kennedy, the director of the IGLP at Harvard Law School, to give us overview and the significance of the topic of today, before handing over to Professor Osama Siddiq, our good old friend, who accepted to be the chair of the panel discussion of today. David, please. David, please help turn on your microphone, please.
Excellent idea. So I just want to welcome everyone to the second webinar. It's a very exciting one, focusing on criminal justice reform, as Anuwan said. And last month, when I introduced these webinars, I said that our goal is to offer a range of different perspectives, all of which in one or another way challenge mainstream thinking about the important issues that we're going to be picking up. The goal of the webinars is to explore alternative ideas or heterodox ways of approaching very familiar problems, innovative ways to redefine the issues that we're considering. The overall goal of the webinar series is to encourage all of you to think differently, imaginatively, against the grain of routine analysis, which is a very crucial leadership skill. Last time, we were thinking globally, imagining different multilateralism, asking how some problems get framed as global or even as global crises, when they may have had very different local origins, local impacts, and possible solutions. Were there ways to rethink global problems locally? or rethink the global dimensions of local problems. This time, we're looking at an issue which is everywhere considered quite local, criminal justice. And yet across the world, reform efforts are underway which tackle similar challenges. So one question we might think about is, how should a leader, a resilient leader, undertake comparative inquiry? Should one look for the best practice, or should one look to illuminate the political choices that others have made to inform the political choices that you will make? Each of our experts today comes at the question in this second light, undertaking comparative analysis to expose the choices that are involved, rather than to find the one correct solution. And each of our experts has worked on criminal justice reform in a very specific local context, which I'm sure they'll share with you. Bringing them together, I hope, will highlight the choices and the alternatives that were at play, and the stakes of those choices, the winners and losers, as criminal justice institutions shift focus. But let me now turn it over to Professor Osama Siddique, who's been with the IGLP for many years. He's our chair for today's session, a man with deep experience in criminal justice reform in Pakistan, who will take us right into the issue with his terrific panel of experts. So take it away, Osama.
Thanks a lot, David, and thank you, Anawan. It's always a pleasure and privilege to do something with TIJ and the Institute for Global Law and Policy. And we have a fantastic panel today because of the diversity of experience and Colorado, Professor Libby Edler from Northeastern University and Professor Luis Eslava from Kent Law School. I, for one, work mostly on South Asia, and I'm based in Pakistan. David has already sort of explained it quite clearly that what we are trying to set out to do here. And I just want to underline that this is really a discourse, not amongst only the panel members, but indeed a conversation with all of you. Because in our past experience as well, engaging with the academics from the region and the policy professionals has been fantastic. You bring to the table such vast expertise and insights of how policy actually works. And this sort of dialogue between academics and policymakers can be incredibly useful. So we are going to try our best not only to lay out some themes which may be of common interest, but to actually get active input from you and extensive input from you in order to further build the dialogue and to build this conversation. As David said, that we have lots of contextual and jurisdictional differences, and criminal law particularly is looked upon as something which is municipal. And one would therefore wonder what exactly is the merit of finding out what is happening in Colombia or in Sri Lanka or, let's say, Thailand or Cambodia. But I think as it will emerge, and this is what our past experience tells us, that the more you look at it, the more you realize that despite all these differences, there are lots of commonalities of approach, of obstacles, of institutional impediments, and therefore it becomes quite useful to look at comparative examples and to see whether we can learn something from that, whether there's something which can be replicated, something which can provide inspiration for a more sort of imaginative approach. And therefore, I think it's important to look at that. Now, what we try and do at IGLP and what we've done with TIJ in the past as well is to advocate a multifariousness of approach. Not just to look at law from the... There's some disturbance. Maybe, yeah, so I think some people need to just switch the mic off. So as I was saying that, I think what we underline is the multifariousness of approach to look at legal issues and challenges, whether it may be in criminal law or any other field of law, for multiple angles, disciplinary angles, multiple approaches. And while we do that, I think one of the sort of important ingredients of our approach at IGLP is to be heterodox. We don't take the orthodox on face value, to be critical, and to really sort of try and see what are the different perspectives possible and whether there's a multiplicity of solutions. So the three themes that we have selected today are generic enough, hopefully, to be of relevance and interest to all of you. And yet at the same time, hopefully they lend themselves to some specific insight from the jurisdictions which we are going to cover, which range from the United States to Cuba to Latin America to South Asia. So there's a vast sort of geographical coverage. But at the same time, we're looking at some common themes. The first really is the theme, the dichotomy of the criminal and the victim. And I shall explain that a bit further when we get to that, how that dichotomy or that categorization or that understanding of the notion of the criminal and the victim may have changed or is changing. The other is, of course, prisons, which are so very important. And I think it's important to explore the rise and fall of the prison approach or the prison state in many parts of the world. And the third is the larger significant question of decriminalization. Are we still sort of approaching crime from a criminalization approach? And are we sort of looking at it from a narrow legalistic way? Are we trying to look at other sort of sectors and sort of phenomena which it interacts with? What is happening by way of decriminalization? So those are some of the themes in which I'm hoping the panelists will have very sort of specific things to discuss given their experience. What we are going to do first, and I sort of conclude this here, is to request my fellow panelists to briefly introduce themselves in terms of their research interests and in terms of the important sort of questions which have emerged in terms of their research, which are also connected to these themes. And they'll do this for 5 minutes each, and then we launch into the conversation itself. So let me request Aya, first of all, to introduce herself, and then Libby, and then finally Luis, and then I'll say a few words about myself. Thank you.
Good evening and good afternoon and good morning. It's 5:30 in the morning here, so it's very early for me. And Happy New Year and Sawadee Ka. I am very happy to join you. I wish I was there in person because I'm up in the mountains and it's snowy here. My name is Aya Gruber. I am a professor of law at the University of Colorado in Boulder, Colorado in the United States. I have been teaching criminal law and criminal procedure with, of course, a United Statesian view for about 20 years now. And before that, I was a criminal defense attorney, both in a state system, a more regional system in Washington, DC, and in the federal system in Miami, Florida. So in that capacity, I saw a range of cases, from your very local theft cases to transnational human trafficking and transnational drug cases. But what I really want to talk about today is a research focus of mine that I've been working on probably for the better part of a decade and a half. And that is the question of whether criminal law, that is policing, prosecution, and imprisonment within the larger prison system, can be used as a promising tool to achieve equality for women and sexual minorities and achieve gender justice. And I'm just going to go back a little bit to some personal stories, because sometimes I think it's helpful to think through some of these really big issues and big theoretical questions with more local pluralistic stories. So, back when I was in law school at Harvard many years ago, I always was in a feminist defense attorney dilemma. And let me explain. On the one hand, I had realized that the American prison system, this was in the late 90s, was growing at a rapid pace in a way that tended to exacerbate the problems of the most vulnerable people, racial minorities, the poor, sexual minorities, and women. Crime was becoming a very hot button and had been for many decades, a hot button political issue, which led to the reactionary promulgation of criminal laws for everything, which in turn gave exceptional discretion to the police officers, which they were using in an incredibly violent and racialized way. And I think, today, and especially this last summer with the George Floyd protests, it was really a moment of national awareness that we've put all this faith in policing, prosecution, and punishment in a way that didn't necessarily improve the underlying problems that we hoped it would, and caused a lot of problems, especially in the space of race relations. Okay, so I realized all this. I also realized it because my family had personal experience. I'm, part Japanese American, and my mother was put into basically concentration camps during World War II on the basis of her race. So I have this sense that, there's a real problem with using incarceration as a solution to problems, especially for people who care about justice and care about equality. On the other hand, there was always a sense coming from feminists, coming from a long history, that the biggest challenge facing women in the United States was the challenge of domestic abuse, that is battering, wife battering, girlfriend battering, and sexual abuse, as in rape. And there was also this general sense that the solution to those problems was to consistently ratchet up policing, law enforcement, prosecution. And I adhered to this notion that gender justice equaled more and more and more and more criminal law. And I adhered to it even knowing that our criminal law is usually enforced by incredibly masculinist police officers. The system itself is based not on principles of forgiveness and love, but pain and punishment. And the incarceration system itself is rife with gender violence and sexual violence. But still, there was just this notion that I had held on to for 20 years, that the key to serving women who are subjected to violence was this specific criminal law space. And, I was about to become a public defender, a criminal defense attorney. And I adhered to this notion so much that I actually dreaded more representing a man charged with a low-level domestic abuse than representing somebody charged with a murder. Like, that caused me more stress. And then I actually started practicing within the domestic violence system, and I noticed some very interesting things. First of all, the way that the US system is structured, an adversarial system, is supposed to be a contest to get to the truth, right? You have the defense attorney, you have the prosecutor, they duke it out, and there are rules of evidence and they get to the truth. But the reality of it is that we have a plea bargain system in which the vast majority of the cases have turnstile justice, in and out, arrested, in, out, you do your sentence, you get collateral consequences. So what I saw in this domestic violence system that takes violence against women seriously was a revolving door where mostly poor Black Americans were caught up in a system where they did short jail stints, somebody lost their job, they became ineligible for public benefits and public housing, and in fact, a lot of the relationships stayed intact and they stayed violent. I saw several cases of women, the women who called the police, ending up themselves arrested for domestic violence because maybe they fought back, right? And especially Black women were considered more masculinized than white women, so they were more likely to be arrested as mutual perpetrators, mutual combatants. I saw a lot of the children being taken away because domestic violence in the home was a grounds for family law intervention. So in the end of the day, another thing that would happen was the couples didn't understand it, but a woman would call the police to, you know, get help because she was in a fight with a husband. And the couple was undocumented. They were undocumented immigrants. And he would go into that revolving door police system. And in order to avoid a lengthy jail sentence, he would plead guilty, not understanding, and the wife also not understanding that it made him deportable and he would have to be sent away and from their children. So there were all these things that were mixed up in this system that seemed to disparately impact the poorest among us, the most marginalized among us, and even, and sometimes especially, marginalized women. And so it really led to a decades-long desire to understand, how did we get here? How did the feminist gender justice movement become synonymous with more policing, prosecution, violent arrest, and long incarceration within a mass incarceration nation? And so I can talk a little bit, I've gone on too long, and I can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A, but I basically spent many years delving into the history of these systems, the critical choices that the law reformers made along the way, the assumptions that they were working under about how they could control this massive criminal system, which had its own technologies, right, and its own embedded players, and, you know, a lot of the strategic choices that they made, and also the development of philosophy, a punitive impulse that, you know, transcended feminism, that, you know, sort of throwing a criminal law onto the books, onto the legislative books, was a worthwhile way of getting at social problems. It certainly gave politicians a lot of political capital, you know, but that, you know, if you had it on the books, everything would flow from that. And that was a very popular, it proved to be a very popular but extremely problematic line of reasoning that has ascended in the United States for at least 40 years. So anyway, I've gone on too long, and I'm happy to talk more about the details of this kind of tension between using criminal law as a tool to achieve equality and justice. And I think with that, I throw it back to Osama, or?
Okay, so first of all, let me ask the person who's taking care of it to keep me unmuted, because I need to interfere or intervene as needed, otherwise I can't. Thank you so much. That was really a rich description of multiple themes and issues, which we are going to elaborate upon as we proceed to the main conversation. But you're absolutely right in terms of the intended and unintended consequences of a purely criminal law approach, with all that it brings in terms of who dominates it, the hierarchies, the gender, and its sort of asymmetric impact on people who are already vulnerable. So that's great. And if I may request Libby to please sort of introduce yourself and your main preoccupations in terms of your research interests.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to thank the IGLP TIJ Global Webinar Series and David for including me in this conversation. As Osama says, I teach at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, both in a law school and in a gender studies program. And my main focus has been on legal progress, mainly in the US, but more recently in Cuba as well, for lesbian, gay, and transgender populations. I'm going to abbreviate that as LGBT. In the US, the focus of advocates on behalf of LGBT people has largely been on higher order, often constitutional rights and guarantees, including the right to assemble, the right to expression, the right to privacy, general equality and anti-discrimination guarantees, and then also one of the pieces of this, which is not constitutional but has been a major agenda item of the advocates for LGBT populations in the U.S., is for protection under hate crime statutes, which are, there are federal and state, in the US, there are federal and state criminal laws that protect people from violence based on certain identity characteristics, race among them, and sexuality and gender identity have been added to many of those statutes. And then the #1 agenda item of the LGBT advocacy community in the US in recent years has been access to same-sex marriage, which we now have as a constitutional right in the US, as you may know. However, it continues to be a matter of contest because of religious exemptions that persons opposed to same-sex marriage have to it. So my primary focus has been the ways in which this agenda on behalf of LGBT Americans has actually divided the LGBT community along lines of class and race. It has provided many advantages in the context of employment, in the context of family, and in the context of social inclusion for some LGBT Americans who primarily are middle and upper class and overwhelmingly white. But it has left many people behind, particularly those that were in the greatest need before many of these achievements. And so what we have now is a situation where gay and lesbian Americans are actually slightly wealthier than the average American on average, but also slightly poorer. What I mean by that is that the divide, the gap between gay and lesbian Americans, the wealth gap between the rich and the poor is actually more pronounced, more severe than the wealth gap between rich and poor Americans generally. And so what we find is higher rates in the gay community of homelessness, higher rates of food insecurity, and higher rates of criminalization. And so here I think I can somewhat tie some of the themes of my own work to those of Aya's, in that one of her prime objectives is to push on the question of whether criminal law is a good tool to use to achieve equality for women. And here I want to put criminal law in the larger context of conditions that LGBT people, and especially poor LGBT people in the United States, are facing, and ask whether criminal law is a tool that that is equally beneficial to more privileged sectors of the population and more marginalized and low-income sectors of that population. And I'll talk a little bit about how the gay and lesbian community has actually sought out the protections of the criminal law. In hate crimes is a key location there, and I'll get into that a little bit more when we get to discussion theme #1. And so my goal is to, I speak largely to advocates. That's who I am addressing in my work, to try to assist them in framing strategies for advancement of LGBT populations in the US, that would work for a broader swath of LGBT people and not just for those who are already enjoying social inclusion and legal advantages. And so my goal is to shift attention to how to use law to not only advantage those most privileged members of the community, but also people of color, low-income people, people who live outside of major urban areas, minors, and others who have less access to some of the benefits that gay and lesbian advocacy work has brought. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Libby. And thank you for framing it so clearly. Like, and you're absolutely right. I think one really significant common theme here is how do we look at criminal law as a tool, as an approach, as a prescription? Because it's obvious and it's evident that it gets deeply impacted by both the context and also the respective sort of bargaining power of the different parties and their vulnerabilities. And as both you and I have pointed out, it's quite remarkable to notice how it has not only perhaps further disempowered people who are already disempowered, but perhaps also created new categories of disempowerment in terms of how it plays out. I'll quickly now request Luis to elaborate on his research interests. I'll speak a few words about mine, and then we'll go into the main conversation where hopefully we can elaborate on that further. Thank you.
Thank you so much to IGLP and to TIJ for the invitation to speak in this webinar, to Aisha and Libby for fantastic interventions, which I hope I can complement in a few minutes now, and to Osama and to Davis for the framing of the panel, particularly David's point about what should a resilient leader keep in mind when think about criminal justice and criminal justice reform today. So I am based at the University of Kent, at the School of Law, Kent Law School, where I am a reader in international law, and I also co-direct the Center for Critical International Law. In my research and in my teaching, I place emphasis on the way in which international norms and institutional practices and international transformations have a massive impact on everyone across the planet, but in particular, people in the Global South. So with this kind of framing of the Global South, I want to just explain how I get to questions about criminal justice, and hopefully I will say at the end of these 5 minutes, something about how that's relevant for a leader that wants to be resilient. So one of the things that is happening at the moment across the planet, and in particularly in the Global South, is the transformation of the nature of poverty. And this is something that Ajas has already alluded to, and Libis has alluded to, and I just want to kind of flesh that out a little bit more. So there has been a significant reduction of extreme poverty over the last 3 decades. So many, according to many people's account, people living with less than $1.90 per day in US dollar terms have basically halved. So 30 years ago, we had around 2 billion people living in extreme poverty. We have now around a little bit less than 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. Now, the problem with this massive trump is that this reduction has not been global. Actually, if you disaggregate those gains in terms of regional contributions of lifting people out of extreme poverty, Asia and Southeast Asia, including Thailand, have done the biggest job. So there have been regions in the world that have done the most in order to lift people out of extreme poverty. Many other regions in the world, in particular Latin America, which is a region that is very close to my heart, has basically remained the same in terms of the proportional distribution of people living in extreme poverty. So the same number, in proportional terms, the same proportion of people living in extreme poverty today is the same as was in the 1980s. The second big problem with this success that we have had in order to have extreme poverty is that when we go beyond $1.90 per day, when we go beyond $1.90 per day, and then start using other thresholds to assess poverty, what we can see, again, at the planetary level, is that actually today, that gains in terms of extreme poverty haven't been compensated in terms of actually lifting people out of poverty. Today, many international organizations say that talking about $1.90 per day in 2021 is ridiculous. It is it's extremely meager account or number to determine who is poor or no. The $1.90 per day only talks about extreme poverty. If we really are serious here talking about poverty, we need to use as a threshold 10 American dollars per day. And if you take $10 per day, around 65% of the global population live with less than that. And $10 American dollars per day is important is because many international organizations, again, say that that's what is needed to live a life with dignity in the 21st century. I'm just going to repeat the number once again. Around 65% of the global population live with less than $10 per day, which means that lives with less than they need in order to live a life with dignity in the 21st century. This is astonishing numbers. Now, behind this reality that I just give you a quick account of, there are several things. One of those is that the global economy increasingly relies on services, increasingly relies on financialization and financial speculation to generate wealth. And that also we're witnessing the emergence of automation, the idea that machines can do the job of humans at a larger scale. So in 2017, for example, the McKinsey Global Institute reported that by 2030, the same year where the Sustainable Development Goals need to be fulfilled, 800 million people will be out of work because of automation, this phenomena. This phenomena has been called the end of work or the end of the working man as the figure, the central figure of thinking about global development and political organization. Now, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated these trends. The World Bank, in the most recent report, just a few weeks ago, in a report just a few weeks ago, argued that the pandemic has thrown into extreme poverty, around 120 million people over the past 12 months. And it has thrown around 200 million into that larger bracket just above the poverty line. So the poverty today is way bigger. And here is the connection with the criminal justice system is putting further pressure on a system that was already about to burst before the pandemic. So, so this is, just to conclude this, on the one hand, these issues that I'm mentioning here have basically forcing an increasing number of people to find the means outside the official, formal, legal ways. So we have an increasing levels of low-level criminality being reported across the planet. It is no surprise if you have 65% of the global population living just above the poverty line. And the other problem is that increasingly states have, given that they're unable to capture resources, given that the industrial levels or the industrial outputs are dropping, they increasingly have less resources in order to properly fund a criminal justice system that is not punitive. So my work in this area has clearly demonstrated that even in cases in Latin America where local governments have wanted to do the best in terms of criminal justice reform, governments do not have the necessary means, the necessary financial means to properly offer solutions, long-term solutions, particularly to young people trapped in not just in extreme poverty, but that space that I described here as just living above the poverty line. So the challenges are enormous, and I just want to conclude with two in particular for resilient leaders. One is that we need policy innovation in terms of adapting national and regional economies to this end of the work that I just described here. And obviously we can talk about more about that later. And the second, I think, challenge here and task for everyone, especially for those leaders that want to be resilient in front of these transformations, is to find ways of supporting, in particular, young people that have been trapped in extreme poverty, but again, that are trapped in that large, massive, significant, larger bubble called this new poverty, as I will call it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis. I thank you for sort of emphasizing and bringing to the table the entire phenomenon of the Global South and its particular challenges. What I also hear you saying is the significance of re-examining the economic and structural realities of these societies in terms of how poverty is defined, how poverty impairs people in multiple ways, its linkage with criminality. And I'm sure we'll get a chance to further hear more from you. And I think one would be particularly keen to hear from you about your specific research on children in Colombia who are living on the margin and their particular vulnerability, and where the state response falls short, which you also hinted at. I'll be very quick about what I do, because we're running sort of into now the main conversation slot. We've sort of slightly gone over time. So my own work, amongst other things, on criminal justice reform sort of looks at all facets of it in terms of intra-institutional linkages, processes, systems. My approach is something which borrows a lot from American legal realism. So where you sort of think about law in books being very different from how law functions in practice, from critical legal theory, sociology of law, and very importantly, sort of post-coloniality and post-colonial literature, because I come from a context where colonial, not just laws, but also institutional setups, approaches, assumptions, categorizations of people continue to influence how we look upon the citizen, less as a citizen and more as a subject. And then that naturally raises the question about the unintelligibility of law, maybe because of complexity, language, all kind of Kafkaesque sort of aspects to it, and the alienation it can cause. Like Libby, like Aya, and Louise, my preoccupation is also the asymmetric impact of the formal legal system on different people. And then two other things which interest me and where I've done a bit of work is firstly the use of data by legal scholars and policy people, because we don't really do a lot of empirical work. So as a practical policy prescription, how much that matters. And the second is how, if you compare to any other sector, the justice sector seems to be quite antiquated when it comes to administration, the administrative part of justice, and how that can be incredibly disempowering. But now let me sort of move to the first theme, and already so much has been said which can be elaborated upon, but just to focus on what all three of our panelists sort of referred to in terms of law as a tool. I think it's also important and useful to re-examine how we define the criminal and the victim. And my sort of first question is really whether the notion of the criminal and the victim is that something which seems to be changing in your particular context, for better or for worse, especially in these COVID times. And we can use any particular example of any particular kind of crime which you're more sort of interested in or working on. And you and I had some conversation in the context of domestic violence, crimes against women, female trafficking, and you've done work in that area. And would you care to elaborate a bit more on this entire dichotomy and whether it works and how can it be further problematized?
Thank you so much. I think that is a great insight, trying to understand how narratives and how we imagine who victims are, who criminals are, and how they relate to each other affects policy. And I think policy in the criminal justice space is often made at the level of seeing sort of a very spectacular and terrible crime in which there was a random, like, let's say, attack of a person, and the criminal got away with it, and we react by imagining that if we had stronger criminal laws, it would have prevented it. The reality of those kind of spectacular attacks is they're already punished under criminal law. And when you make criminal law policy, generally it doesn't impact those cases in which, A, there's a spectacular crime, or B, the victims and the perpetrators are so separate. So one thing the domestic violence issue brings up is the ways in which the victims and the accused may have convergent lives and interests, right? We imagine this situation where they're wholly separate, and the more the criminal suffers, the better off the victim is. But the relationships of victims and criminals are far more complicated. So first of all, most of the people who perceive a benefit from a lot of these reactionary crimes are public onlookers. They're not actually in the class of people who are probably ever going to be policed. They see something on the news and they, have this imagination of what to do with it. When the policy trickles down, it is, at least in the United States, it is enforced in the usual places, the poor neighborhoods of color where we see a lot of police present. In those neighborhoods, somebody can be a victim today and be arrested tomorrow. Somebody might be a victim and perpetrator in their own case, right? So this imagination of how criminal law works is more of a top-down imposition than really looking at the classes of vulnerable people that are really the same class that is vulnerable to private crime and violence, right, by the people around them, but also vulnerable to policing that is ostensibly in the name of protecting them. So, so I think I think Libby brought up a really good point that when we have these different justice agendas to protect people, we have these ideas of who speaks for which vulnerable group, right? And so one thing Libby mentioned that I thought was so great is that you have the LGBT group and you have this idea that they have one sense of what's going to bring justice, hate crimes or whatever else. But in fact, within that group, you have a wildly disparate income distribution. You have very, very rich people and very, very poor people. And in fact, it may be the rich portion of that group that is driving policy that disparately impacts poor people. And actually the poor portion of the group would have more synergy with that identity, right? The identity of being economically marginalized, but they're just lumped into the LGBT group who's calling for the criminal law. So I just think all of these realities, and it also goes back to what Luis was saying about the poverty and the new poverty of COVID, all of these realities on the way people live, how crime affects them, how criminal law affects them, are very complicated. And they're kind of flattened into these really spectacular victim versus perpetrator narratives. And I think you have to be careful about that.
That's fascinating. And I find a parallel here as well, because much as it's not sort of documented and categorized and classified in such a formal way, but one thinks back about the colonial state and about colonial India and about all these categorizations of criminality, which were created according to caste lines or according to tribes. So you had all kinds of laws about criminal tribes and criminal castes, and there were certain kinds of activities which were categorized as antisocial. So anyone who was settled was far more preferable than anyone who was actually on the move. And there were all kinds of lifestyles which came which became unacceptable to the colonial state because it went against the very notion of control, the very notion of also sort of charging some kind of a tax. And when I was talking to Libby earlier, and her work about on the homeless, on the marginalized, on the LGBT community, it occurred to me once again how certain notions of criminality and looking at criminality, and then the kind of stock prescriptions which come out of that actually exacerbate the situation. But Libby, it would be great if you could sort of elaborate more on what just I spoke about and your own experience about working with these vulnerable groups and the criminal justice system's response to their lifestyles. Absolutely. Or predicaments. Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely. One important point I wanted to highlight from Aya's discussion just now is the issue of how policy made at a high level actually penetrates down to the ground, and how there may be a very substantial discrepancy between the intention, the purpose, the expression of the high level policy, which may be to, for example, protect women from violence by men, but then the way that it trickles down to the level of enforcement when the police actually arrive at the apartment door is maybe quite different from what was imagined by the policymakers. And just one small example of that from my own field of study is that in order to address domestic violence, and Aya will know much more about this than I do, one of the trends that policymakers picked up was the idea of mandatory arrest. That when the police were called for a domestic violent incident, someone had to be arrested. And there was a good policy purpose for this, which was to ensure that domestic violence was taken seriously and not left as a matter of sort of the husband or man's prerogative. One of the effects of that policy, however, has been negative for gay and transgender youth, which is that if, say, you're in an apartment building and the neighbors hear fighting, and they call the police because they fear some violence may be occurring, and the police arrive and they must arrest someone, and it's actually about a conflict between, let's say, a parent and a youth whose gender is hard to determine, and the young person looks a little strange to the police officer, that's the person who gets arrested and then is saddled with a criminal record for the foreseeable future. So that's just one example of how a policy determined at a high level plays out on the ground. But I want to bring in one other matter, if you'll permit me.
Please.
And that is this issue around hate crimes and bullying. To understand this, I think you have to know just a little bit about gay history in the U.S., and I don't think this is unique to the U.S., but in the U.S., there's a long history of gay and gender variant or transgender people being criminalized, whether for sex acts or for sometimes because they are depicted by stereotype or representation as child molesters, as traitors to the country, and that has resulted in a very bad history of gay people being arrested, being harassed by police, being put in prison, sometimes put in mental hospitals. And so as gay progress has occurred in the U.S., one of the things that the gay movement has sought is immunity from that and respectability, and the idea that gay people are not perpetrators of crimes, but rather victims of crimes. And that has been a major effort on the part of gay advocates, is to portray gay people as victims rather than perpetrators. And again, that is based on the very legitimate reason that gay and transgender people have suffered at the hand of police, did suffer at the hands of police for many decades. And so gay people have fought for the protections of the criminal law. Hate crimes is one of the places where that has happened. For younger people, bullying, which is the kind of school version of the hate crime, of kids being harassed, sometimes violently by other kids if they are perceived to be outsiders in some way, and that disproportionately falls on LGBT kids. And so the idea that gay people need the protection of the police and of the criminal justice system has been one of the things that the gay advocacy community has fought for. But it has, again, has divided the gay community along lines of race and wealth or class, because not all gay people are benefiting equally from that division. So, for example, in certain urban areas such as New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, there have been what I'll call gentrification conflicts. That is that wealthy, often gay men moving into neighborhoods, investing money in the real estate, and supporting vibrant retail and restaurant and art scenes in those neighborhoods, where LGBT kids who may be homeless, are more likely to be of color, are more likely to be transgender, or in some way vary from gender expectations, hang out outside because they don't have access to private space. They make a lot of use of public space, of parks and piers and so on. And that has resulted in conflicts between upper class and more marginalized LGBT people over very small legal questions. For example, the kids getting picked up for lewdness or blocking the sidewalk or loitering, other small crimes, in order to protect the safety, property values, and so on, that very often wealthier gay people are benefiting from. And so the criminalization of LGBT people did not end. It was merely pushed down the racial and class hierarchy. And so that's the result of that kind of attempt at gaining respectability through the solicitation of police protection.
Okay. So many takeaways, Libby, here. Thank you so much. And in what Aya said, and we are also going to connect this to one of the other sort of related themes we're going to talk about, which is criminalization and decriminalization as such. But from what I hear, you know, the sort of failure or the problems of a completely top-down approach, which is not contextually informed, the several negative externalities which can emerge from it. This knee-jerk approach to perhaps have more policing, more state, more enforcement, but not being aware of how that can asymmetrically impact people, especially if you're not cognizant of their own history of vulnerability or exploitation, as well as sort of creation of new avenues of exploitation and vulnerability. So we will sort of hopefully have another chance to further go into this. And Louise, I was wondering, you of course have very rich experience of working empirically as well, and working with vulnerable groups, including children. And this entire argument about redefining or re-envisioning the dichotomy of the criminal and the victim, but also what Aya and Libby have spoken about in terms of the impact of law and not being able to gauge how it's going to impact and why it is important to do that. Would you care to comment in your context on those ideas a bit?
Thank you, Osama. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
So, yes. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. And then what Libby was saying is extremely powerful and already gives, I hope, everyone a sense of what we're dealing with here. What we're dealing with is a society experiences an enormous, profound transformation, both at the level of the distribution of resources, as well as how that distribution of resources, or rather maldistribution of resources, is anchoring in the actual technological transformation of the planet that has come to impact once again those that have been historically at the end of the conga line. In terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of class, but also in terms of geographical positioning. In my work, I have seen many of these things kind of happening right in front of me. My work tries to explore historically as well as empirically, etnographically, as I was saying before, how the international legal order impact peoples across the planet, but in particular in the global south. And what Libby was mentioning before, the impact of these transformations of people in the global south have an additional phase, of course. One is the story of how marginalized populations are impacted by public policy choices in rich countries, and another how they are impacted once again, but in poor settings, in settings that in other contexts are called developing or global south post-colonial. And in my own work, for example, I have been able to follow for a number of years how new policy experimentation in the area of security and development. This is a kind of a space within development practice that tries to use developmental tools in order to bring troublesome kids, unemployed young adults into the official functioning of cities and societies in order to prevent crime, how they actually work. And empirically, what you can notice is that even in cases where they are the best intentions, even when the criminal justice system has been taken over by progressive elites and have trying to do their best, in the best of cases, what they can provide is psychosocial attention. But what people need, and what in particular young people need, are properly paid long-term labor stability, job security. They need to be able to afford a proper housing, food, clothes, so on and so forth, because that's the only thing that will be able to break those cycles of victimization that both Libby and Aisha was talking before. Without that, basically what we see is a society that it is unable to move forward. Obviously, what I'm just saying here, it is very familiar to anyone who has read any critical criminological text or have thought for a few minutes about the relationship between criminality and poverty, and how at the end of the spectrum, the division between victims and criminals becomes very fuzzy. Now, the problem is that we have lost collectively, again at the global level, the capacity of mobilizing public institutions to actually offer employment or to actually distribute resources. So we have the conundrum that we are finding ourselves into at the moment is a society increasingly split, with public institutions unable to close that gap. Who pays the prices? Well, like in the US, like in Colombia, where I study, people at the end of the spectrum, but of course, because resources are different, institutions have different capacity to act, but in the global south become much more violent. And I just want to bring Thailand here. Thailand is a really, really interesting case. It is a country that even after very severe economic crisis, was able to continue offering jobs. Levels of industrialization have remained healthy, but has struggled enormously to significantly kind of close important gaps that producing, like any other parts in the world, that kind of low-level criminality that preoccupies everyone, in particular middle classes. And the easiest response, once again and again, is to be heavy-handed about it, or kind of bring in much more progressive policies. But those progressive policies, as I was saying before, don't have enough resources. So I think the challenge, once again, in terms of public policy, is to think outside the box, I would say. So we need to think about how we can start securing securing forms of living that are stable, that offer proper income, keeping in mind these structural transformations that we have been discussing here.
Thanks a lot, Luis. Let me stay with you for a second. And the reason is because I think there's a good conduit from what you've just described by way of the neglect of the economic dimension and hence greater emphasis on traditional ways of criminalization and approaching crime and these problems like that. And since we are going to talk about decriminalization, so let me launch right into that and we can discuss prisons at the end. In an earlier conversation, you made this important distinction between a heavy-handed and a soft-handed approach to these kinds of issues. And you point out now, of course, that when it comes to rehabilitation, to employment, to economic sort of sustenance, the funds are not there, the political will at times is not here. Now, to the extent that there is perhaps a shift, globally speaking, generally to decriminalization, and I'm going to talk to our other panelists about what their experience is, how much that shift gets impaired in the global south because of what you described? And are there alternatives to what you just described, which have a very financial dimension to them? Are there alternative approaches or ways to ensure that we don't sort of look upon all these things from a purely criminal standpoint with all the negative externalities which we just spoke about?
Thank you so much. I mean, it is important here to be clear about what is the political economy of carcerality, and the issue for global South countries is that carcerality, or the carceral solution, sending people to jails, is extremely expensive. And if you don't have the money to actually manage a proper carceral system, what you are basically is creating a bigger problem. It is no surprise, I hope, for anyone that sending someone with a small, not very complex criminal record to jails basically will be sending that person into the university of how to become a proper, full-on criminal. The only way to deter those trajectories, which are actually quite natural because it's a question about survival, is to have a system that actually kind of minimizes the punitive elements to it, with and compensated with training possibilities and kind of opening the horizons for people that were already in troubles. Now, the no heavy-handed approach in the global south have been taking them up as a result of that as a way of dealing with the cost of the carceral system. So it has slowly emerged, not just simply as the best option in a kind of humanitarian terms, a soft approach, but as the most cost-efficient approach. So some of my colleagues, for example, in Honduras and El Salvador in Central America, where the issue of gang violence is enormous and historically has adopted a carceral approach to the management of crime, thanks to the US aid to help to deal with crime, have an enormous issue. And one thing that they have concluded, and there is a kind of now there's a kind of a policy blueprint, is that the only way that they will be able to solve issues of criminality and issues associated to carcerality is just not to send particularly young people to jails. Okay, the only way that's going to solve is that, and again, this is not just about having a good heart, it's also about being realistic about what current institutions can offer. And I think that pragmatism is important when we're dealing here with the numbers that I was mentioning before.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. And let me just occurred to me when you were talking earlier as well, and this goes also to the issue of not just a top-down legal approach, but also not enough progress towards decriminalization. Now, when you look at the alternatives in terms of a social welfare state and rehabilitation and economic opportunities, I think particularly in the context of LGBT, a lot of these kids end up in the criminal justice system, whereas they should be in the welfare system. So in your context and the way you examine things, where do things stand in terms of decriminalization per se, but the specific LGBT experience?
Well, I guess two things I want to say about this. One is that decriminalization itself can be well-intentioned, but not always go exactly to the benefit of the group that one is trying to help. So, for example, many LGBT youth do wind up performing sex work. And I know we're going to talk about sex work, and I have a lot to say about that. But one of the efforts to try to be softer and treat these youth as victims rather than as perpetrators has been what are called safe harbor diversion programs, where the idea is that instead of sentencing a minor sex worker to a short jail sentence, they would instead be diverted to the child welfare system, which again, it sounds very well-intentioned, soft, and humane, but from the perspective of the young person, it's not always what they're looking for, because, for example, in New York, the penalty for prostitution is up to 90 days in jail. Whereas if you're put into the child welfare system, you may be there until you age out at 18. So if you go in at the age of 15, you've got 3 years ahead of you rather than a maximum of 90 days. And so even that approach, the disparity between the intention, the expressive aspect, and how it plays out for the individual on the ground, there can be quite a gap.
I understand. And I wanted to speak to you, Aya, about the broader sort of question which both our panelists have spoken about, which is whether you see in your context or the context you study a general sort of transition towards decriminalization, and are there any specific areas where you see more of it and others where you see less? You know, I can imagine that gender crimes or crimes against women or violence against women or sex trafficking are areas which are perhaps in a slightly different position as compared to others. And then also the related question, as Libby also said, even decriminalization can have unintended consequences, either because they're dealing with a complex reality where certain assumptions were taken which were incorrect, or because you may have not much changed by way of the kind of people, the operators of the new system. They may be the old operators, right? So it's like old wine in new bottles. So I wanted to ask you to perhaps elaborate on both those points.
Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much to say and so little time, but I think one thing that's very interesting about the US feminism story of criminalizing in the domestic violence space, adding to sexual violence criminalizations, criminalizing new areas of sex, new areas of trafficking, and new areas of sex work, is it gives a sense of what you do in a pre-criminalized state and the choices you make, right? So if we go back to the 1970s for the domestic violence issue, the battered women's movement was very skeptical about things like mandatory arrest, things like increasing jailing the men. They worried that the men would lose their jobs and then the women would have even less economic support than they had. They worried about increasing violence. And the social scientists of the time were identifying a whole bunch of stressors that led to domestic violence, including racial discrimination, economic precarity. And the social scientists at the time, Black feminists and a lot of the Marxist feminists, predicted that if you inserted arrest, just of the man, but actually after these arrest policies, arrests of men increased, by 30% or so. Arrests of women increased by hundreds of percent after these policies. But anyway, if you insert an arrest into an already stressful domestic situation, you're just adding to the stress. So there were a lot of people saying at the time, what women really need in this space is more money, more social capital to be able to negotiate a world in which they can leave the husband, right? Support for their kids, child support, housewife wages, work. So there were all these things on the table. But eventually it all got flattened into criminal law because one of the main feminist narratives was that anything short of arrest and prohibition sent the message that domestic violence was acceptable. So the only acceptable form of state intervention was prohibitionist criminal intervention, right? And so it was a very similar thing with feminists and sex work. So prostitution had a long history of being criminalized to great harm to women in the United States. I mean, overflowing reformatories, really bad red light districts, you know, a whole bunch of things. But then feminists stepped in, and it was a narrative of trafficking, right? And with a narrative of trafficking, you really can't adopt a labor model to sex work, right? It's just, it becomes this horrible thing. You need to be prohibitionist. So then what happened is in these spaces, we have a very rigid prohibitionist law that involves a lot of, you know, arrest, prosecution, and incarceration, which now hasn't met those other goals of, you know, economically supporting women, psychotherapy, different things. And so then what happens is, okay, this criminal law doesn't seem to be working. So then the criminal law actors then move into administering the social welfare services, mostly poorly, that were called for in the first place. And then it leads to this really, really interesting situation. I'll give you the example, kind of taking off of Libya. And I know I'm going on a little, but I just want to throw this example. Yeah, of New York City. I did a study of a major sex work trafficking reform in New York City. And that was moving from a model of like these street sweeps, where you would arrest mostly female and transgendered sex workers. They go through this revolving door of a few days in jail. You know, they go back to working and then, you know, like that. And they said, well, we're going to do a more humane system because we no longer consider female sex workers to be criminals. We consider them to be victims, right? We're going to switch that analysis. So what we're going to do through these courts, instead of give them their 3 days in jail, we're going to reconceptualize them as human trafficking intervention courts. We're going to rename them as human trafficking intervention courts. And what we're going to do is we're still going to arrest the women, but we're not going to convict them. And instead, we're going to connect them with services. Okay, so that sounded good. But what ended up happening is that the women would get arrested, they'd go in there, and the judges would say, okay, 7 meetings with a service provider. And then the public defender, the defense attorney, would come in and say 2, right? And, you know, they bargained to say 4 service meetings. And so this service that was supposed to be helpful to women just became part of that infrastructure of punishment that the women wanted to bargain down, because the very idea that a police officer arrested them, and these vice officers in New York were not good to the women. I mean, they really degraded them when they were arresting them. They called them all kinds of names. If they found condoms on them, you know, they'd use that as evidence against them. So this was really, so the thought that it was this process with the judge and the police and the, you know, people prying into your lives, that was somehow a service that the more you got was a benefit to you, just didn't register, right? Like it couldn't register because the situation of providing this through a criminal system that for hundreds of years had treated the women as not just criminals, but really, you know, sort of morally debauched and really stigmatized and degraded. You know, this idea that you could all of a sudden now in our enlightened era convert it into a social service agency, which is, you know, what a lot of people are doing now, that, you know, at least in the United States, this idea that it's a mass incarceration nation has gotten more traction. It's like this converting over to a social service agency just has these built-in problems. So I'll just sum up that the feminist story can tell us if, try the social service, right? Like try that first, because once you get embedded into those criminal systems, it's going to be very hard to dial them back because they're couched in that language of absolute prohibition, and anything else is condoning the bad behavior. And so with that frame, it's very hard to just get rid of them altogether. And then transferring them is just a very tricky enterprise. So if given the choice to go a criminal route or maybe try a couple things first, I think these stories counsel towards using criminal law down the line after you've already tried some other government interventions in that space, because it's going to be hard to convert it.
No, lots of takeaways. Thank you so much. Lots of takeaways there. I mean, once again, highlights how, frankly, law is a terrain of contestation, and it becomes incredibly important to see who's doing what and for what purpose. But there's also, as you rightly say, a history to it, right? There's a history to how these women have been treated. There are historical attitudes. There are inbuilt biases and prejudices, which are both attitudinal and systemic. And so just calling it a welfare service is not going to be sufficient, but it is clear that perhaps that should be the starting point. Now, at least there's some evolution in that sense, recognizing that that is the direction to move on. But I'll stay with you. Sure, sure.
I'm sorry, I just want to add one sentence to what Aya said.
Please do.
Only because you mentioned child support as one of the alternatives. And child support is another area that I have studied, and I used to work in the child support system in the United States. And what child support is, it certainly many countries have it, but in some ways it's uniquely American because of its absolute rejection of the social safety net. It's about privatizing support, ensuring that the husband or the ex-boyfriend is supporting his children by making direct payments to the former wife or the mother of his children. Or to the welfare system if the welfare system is supporting them. But then what happens when he can't pay? We're back to the criminal justice system.
Okay. So just a couple of housekeeping things. Three things. First of all, we're not doing very well on time, but we got a lot of rich conversations. I'm going to slightly reduce the last module so that we have time for question and answer. Secondly, we have some questions, but they're incredibly long. There's no way I can sort of be part of this and read them and make sense. They'll have to be no more than 3 or 4 sentences. And the last person who sent a question, I sent back a happy face. That was not meant for you, so my apologies. You can reduce that question, please, and I'll make sure that I'll take that. I want to stay with you, Aya, and the reason for that is that, key to what we're talking about, a lot of us are talking about, is incarceration, which is our third theme, really. Prisons. When we spoke earlier, we spoke about the American prison state, whether it's the rise, is it the decline of the prison, or do we see a rise and further rise of the prison in your context? And this entire extremely troubling phenomenon of private prisons. The context where I live in South Asia, you still have around a lot of very typical Benthamite prisons. The panopticon is something you can actually go and physically see. And there's an entire discussion about how, that still impacts society and criminality and attitude to criminality. So I wanted to both, stay with you, and so we can seamlessly go into this conversation about prisons. To get your assessment, where do we stand in our respective contexts in terms of our approach to prisons and the role we envision them as playing? And is it as Foucauldian as we read about? Is it still about normalization and monitoring and sort of really, looking at prisoners in a certain way, or is there any progress in any desirable direction?
I think it's a great question, and I also think it's related to something I'm seeing in the chat about just this whole shifting victims of sexual violence into this system. And so a couple of things, I think with the Foucauldian, which is the idea that, everybody keeps saying, well, the United States incarcerates the most of its citizens of any country on the planet. And 1 in 4 Black men is under penal supervision as we speak, that, that's a problem, right? So and it's not solving crime. So on the one hand, there's this idea that this is a system that has failed. Well, Foucault would say, no, it is a system that's succeeded. It has succeeded in managing post-Civil War, emancipated men of color, Black men and women. It has succeeded in managing poor people. It has succeeded in creating the kind of spatial segregation that Libby alluded to earlier on, and Luis, that is great for middle and upper middle class, but terrible for the unruly masses. I think that's partially true, but I also think that it's just the point at which politics and history and racism have conspired to make this carceral system that now is a machine that's almost self-functioning, right? It has embedded players and all that. One of the things, though, that in theory, and this just also becomes part of the system. I mean, in theory, you're supposed to have these trials and you're supposed to test this evidence, and you're only supposed to put people in jail if you can prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. And when it comes to sex crimes, because of child predator panic in the 90s, we're talking about a lot of sex crimes being elevated to life offenses. So for example, in Colorado, where I live, almost every sexual offense is an indeterminate life sentence. So these are incredibly high sentences, right? And the cases you see on campus that were once in the Title IX system. So 2 people get drunk and, the victim is very drunk and they have sex. Those are now ending up with life offenses. So when you have that at stake and you have a contested terrain of what is or isn't sexual violence, people go to trial. And if there's anything we know about a criminal trial, whether you're a defendant or a victim, it is an incredibly traumatic experience, especially if you're a victim of sexual violence. Like you have, the police, they're men. They're not very good. You can try to train the police to be trauma informed, but usually what that does then is just make them not very good investigators, right? They just are like, I'll just pass this on to the prosecutor. The SANE examinations, the nurse practitioner examinations, those are very invasive. All of the things about trial are invasive. And at the end of that invasive trial, what you might get or what you might not get is somebody going to jail for life, which also is a piece of trauma production in my mind, because you have to believe of yourself then that you're a rape victim of a person who's in jail for life. So that system is something to me that should be used incredibly sparingly, right? Like for offenders that need to be incapacitated, it shouldn't be used as a system to send a message about gender justice. It shouldn't be expanded to cover everything because we want society to culturally, be better about sexual relationships. This is a horribly psychologically, economically, and socially costly system that I think advocates and reformers should use with care. And so I'm not saying that I think we should decriminalize rape, but I think we should be very clear-eyed about expanding this criminal sexual violence system in order to change norms of how people approach sexuality and women's sexual equality and freedom. It's just a system that has these costs and may not provide, especially the psychic benefits that are touted for victims. Because usually victims are told like, oh yeah, this is the way you heal.
Sure,
you go through this criminal process.
Mm-hmm.
And in reality, it's, and the only other alternative to it is maybe make it some expedited process. But then you have a lack of due process that can land somebody in jail for life, which is inconsistent with
I think we need to now quickly move to the questions and answers because we've pretty much exhausted our time here. I just want, if possible, from Luis, a quick 2-minute reaction, because I wanted to also get a perspective on the Global South, the incarceration in the Global South, where things stand. If you could please do that, just a couple of minutes, and then we'll go directly to questions. As to questions, I would really appreciate if they start coming in now so I can start processing them. Short and sweet, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just gonna thank Aisha for the kind of mentioning the brutality that characterizes the criminal justice system in the US, and to make the important point, particularly in a North-South conversation, about the brutality that characterizes the North. So what is in many occasions is developed, being very advanced, it is accompanied by a huge amount of institutionalized violence. And this is a very, 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 very important thing to keep for everyone to keep in mind and to repeat in every forum. In terms of ways forward and thinking outside the box, and jumping here away from criminal justice system as such, we have been discussing the limits of carcerality, or carceral response, or traditional institutional responses to crime. That's very important. So the question is, so where to put our emphasis, where to look for solutions. And I think in the Global South, one of those spaces is to rethink about how people earn their living. In a project that I'm involved at the moment on the effects of the pandemic on informal workers in Colombia in particular, but thinking more broadly in terms of the Global South. Around between 60 and 65% of people in the Global South live from the informal economy, or they are informal workers. And it's interesting, informal economy here and informal workers in this context, because one of the responses, the traditional responses, has been formalizing them as the final objective, and what that doesn't work, criminalizing them. And that's an incredibly limited response to the problem, similar to the criminal responses to domestic violence, as Aisha was putting before. If we attack the informal economy and we just become obsessed with formalizing it or criminalizing, basically we're killing the only possibility for people to secure a living. If you kill that option, that is vital, that provides jobs. Basically, what we're going to see immediately is a rise in lower level crime, and more pressure put on the carceral system, and middle classes calling for even for new rounds of heavy hand. So thinking outside the box is importantly, but also thinking about what is viable in the Global South is crucial in this context.
So thank you so much. Moving on to the questions. So one of the questions is essentially underlining the aspect of the experience of the vulnerable groups with the criminal justice system, the fact that how it grinds you down, right? So it's not just the outcomes, it's not just the intent, it's also the process, it's also the multiple steps. And I guess the question, which is perhaps more like an observation, goes once again to the necessity of focusing on the victim in terms of support and protection and sensitivity, less on punishment, more on the victim. I think this goes back, Libby and Aya, to the earlier conversation about who are we focusing on? Is it all about punishment? Is it about one of those goals, or is it about really the victim? And if that is the case, is the victim really being showcased as the primary target of the intervention here? So it's not really a question, but I think it's an invitation to perhaps elaborate a bit more on that, if you care to, while I scout for more questions.
Sure. So one, I think, important aspect of youth encounters with police, and I will say that LGBT youth are much more likely to endure encounters with the police than their heterosexual peers. And that, is largely because of the high homelessness problem that they face, and that if you are living a lot of your life in public space, you're simply going to be in a position to have more police encounters and to be more criminalized. And part of the way that kids get to that place, that LGBT kids get to that place, is because of a whole lot of other conditions that I'm not sure I have time to describe, but that put them on the street in a position where there's not a lot of legal options for how to support themselves. And so they do wind up committing illegal acts, sex work chief among them, but also shoplifting. They may not have a place to urinate, and so they're going to do that outside, and that's going to subject them to arrest. So they're going to have more encounters with the police than other kids their age. And then once they're in those encounters, I think one useful way to think about those encounters is as instances of bargaining. That is, there is a power dynamic between police officers and the people that they are pursuing or addressing. And so, for example, if a kid is going to be arrested, what is that going to mean for other things? Is it going to hurt their future job prospects? Is it going to make it impossible for them to get welfare benefits? And if all of those things are going to flow from an arrest, if those are possibilities, that radically disempowers the young person in the encounter with the police officer when it comes to things like how respectful to be, whether the young person could be coerced into performing sexual favors for the police officer, whether the person could be coerced into functioning as an informant on other people in the kids' community. So, so there are a number of questions that another choices that the young person is going to have to make, and those choices are going to be conditioned by what the consequences are that the young person can foresee.
Okay, great. Aya, would you like to say something, or?
Yes, Libby's, and I know you're running out of time, so I'll try to make it quick. Libby's answer totally reminded me of a couple of things. We in the United States right now, we have like this massive awareness that policing and street policing and people who are unsheltered are, incredibly vulnerable to street policing, has a lot of these costs in terms of trauma, police brutality, especially to kids, right? And one of the things Libby just mentioned was the police extorting sex from unhoused kids and others. Well, our solution often to those problems of policing is more criminal law. So we'll just make special criminal laws against the policing and we'll prosecute the police. It's interesting because every so often in these conversations, it will come up, well, what about just de-policing this area? What about just, telling the police to stop arresting unhoused LGBT youth, right? Like just tell them to stop. And usually one of two things happens. Either the police department, instead of stopping, they reform. So they're like, no, we're not going to stop policing. We'll add some really expensive body cameras. Or no, we won't stop interfering with people, but now we'll do community policing, right? So there's always this thought that in order to decriminalize or de-police, you need to somehow still keep the police in that space. And there's an interesting experiment, a political experiment, where in 2014, right after a bunch of litigation in New York City, the mayor just directed the police to stop, to no longer seize and pat down basically Black and Latino men, like just to stop that program of stopping and frisking men on the street. And so the police did, and that police intervention went down by 98%. Crime also went down. In other words, they just stopped the policing with no substitute, with no reform, with nothing. They stopped the policing and the world improved, right? The world for the people on the street improved. But this is a very hard thing for criminal justice actors to wrap their mind around. And in the domestic violence space, some of the programs in all spaces that have been shown to be most promising in terms of victimization reduction are housing and shelter programs. Just merely getting people into shelter, into a place where they can stay privately, is something that protects them from both private and state violence. But those are like very small separate from reform.
Okay, thank you. Couple of interesting questions, and I want to make sure we get get to all of them, and if you could sort of concisely try and answer them. So one question is from Juan, which seems to be saying that doesn't the fact that law is so precisely worded provide an opportunity for us to exclude negative externalities? In other words, is it a drafting issue? Is it the fact that laws are sort of sometimes misconstrued or made open to interpretation? I mean, my immediate reaction to that is that obviously more precisely formulated laws are better than less precisely formulated laws, but the kind of issues that all of you have been pointing out are not just tackled, they can't just be tackled through better drafting. I think what is being pointed out is that there is a lot more to the social, economic, political context. There's a lot more to vulnerability, to backgrounds, to structural sort of inadequacies, which cause many injustices to take place and stereotyping to take place. And so I think it would be perhaps a mistake to conceive this only as a drafting issue. I mean, formalism has its own limitations in various ways. If anything, I think what's being advocated is that we go beyond that. If somebody wants to respond to that further, that's fine. Otherwise, there's another interesting question, which I think had to do with the political economy of justice, right? So I think you also spoke earlier about how the carceral system is like a machine. It's like a juggernaut which carries on. Now, in my own experience working in South Asia, the biggest challenge at times to reform is the fact that the people who run a particular institution or system are the ones least interested in changing it, obviously, unless there is external pressure or contestation. Why would they? Because there's a huge transaction cost to changing, and oftentimes they benefit from it, or they just don't want to do something new. How is that something which still manifests itself as an issue? And how is it important to appreciate the political economy of criminal justice if we intend to do anything differently with it? Is that a factor which strikes you as important? Anyone, if you care to respond to that?
I'm happy to say something
please,
about it.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. So I think these are very different things that we can say about it. I just want to point to the maybe known fact for many of our colleagues in Thailand and in the region about how important it has become to secure cities, to be able to welcome international investment, to secure property, to secure contracts. So when we think today about the political economy of the criminal justice system, one of the things that we need to consider is the larger culture that has been developed around the idea of security and the idea of having streets clean of crime and so on and so forth. And if we take into consideration the conversation that we have been having here, there's different ways of tackling that. There is the heavy-handed way, which basically will contribute to the problem, or there's another way. And there's other way we really try to make the most out of these new pressures put on local governments to be responsive towards the security in a way that actually in the long run, we have better communities. I think once again, so there's one traditional way to go about it. History has demonstrated that outcomes are not always positive. There's other way, which is the space of policy innovation, the space of thinking things in context. And in the global south, the space in which we really need to take seriously the structural constraints put on governments. This is not to say that there are no good options, there are no good ways of moving forward. Is that we need to start from what is in front of us and try to make the most out of it in a creative way.
Okay, thank you. Thitirat has a very interesting observation about the fact that perhaps in developing countries, the cause of crime is really looked upon as an individual issue, almost like individual blame. Is there a way to impart to more people that this is a structural issue? I mean, this goes to the heart of so much which has been done on criminal justice. And I just want to say this is not just a developing country issue. I think a recognition of the structural is something which is a challenge everywhere. Any observations as to how, ignorance or negligence of the structural actually makes the problem worse? Anyone? A short sort of reaction to this, maybe?
Well, let me say that for the LGBT youth population, there is no doubt that the structure, which is built in part, not entirely, but in part by a set of legal conditions that have to do with family law, the foster care or child welfare system, the juvenile delinquency law, all of those things that tend to push kids into running away from their homes of origin if they are not being well treated as gay, lesbian, or transgender kids. And then all of the structural issues of trying to survive, the contractual limitations on their limited capacity to contract under American law. They don't have full capacity to contract. There are child labor laws that prohibit them from working or sometimes from working in certain settings, like settings where there's alcohol or settings where the conditions are hazardous or working late hours. They're all they can't, the youth shelters is one of the things that Aya mentioned, shelter as a major solution. For kids, the federal rule is that you can only stay in them for 3 nights before they call your parents. So there are a million structural conditions that put kids in a position where they turn to the underground economy to survive, and those things put them in contact with the criminal justice.
Okay, thank you. Here's another very important question. We're getting a whole spate of really good, insightful questions. And this has to do with the fact that all of us have spoken about bias and discrimination when it comes to the operators of the criminal justice system. So what should we do? Is training the solution? Is training in being more sort of sensitive? I mean, let me take a crack at it first, because I've been involved in training quite a bit, and much as I think it has value if done right, but I also think that training is a huge buzzword in the reform world, in the rule of reform world, for not taking on the more difficult challenges, because trainings are easy to conduct. You can fly in consultants and you can make modules and you can show it as a deliverable. I'm not undermining or sort of undervaluing the importance of it, but it seems to me, at least in my experience, that you need a much more multifarious approach. The system, the policing system itself, in many contexts requires revisiting, because oftentimes the processes are broken or they're inadequate or they're open to abuse. You need better monitoring systems. You need better assessments. More often than not, you need external evaluations of institutions, because it turns out that it's completely insular the way they actually gauge their performance. I think incentive systems and accountability systems in most cases are problematic. A lot of institutions are not very transparent in terms of sharing information with the public. So there's very little public accountability. So I think it would be perhaps simplistic to just think of training. I think it's one of several. And then once again, one size does not fit all. You really have to look at a particular context to see what the nature of the bias and discrimination is, and whether it can be dealt with through positive reinforcement, through more coercive mechanisms. That's my take. It may not necessarily work everywhere else. If somebody else has another thought on it, different from mine or similar, kindly let me know. Otherwise, I can identify another question. Okay, so Luis, did you want to say something?
Or just very,
Sure.
very quickly, I think in my mind, this question is connected to the previous one about how to fight against individualized perceptions of criminality. And I think one of the big tasks for everyone in the criminal justice system and policy making more broadly is that to understand that what we are dealing here is with perceptions and representations. So Libby was very, very clear about the importance of challenging assumed perceptions about kind of the LGBTQ community, in particular when this representation are addressed to the lower socioeconomic scale of that group, because they has devastating effects. But similarly, it happens in other contexts and have an impact on criminal justice system too. So I was speaking before about informal workers, and here is really important. So one of the main tasks is how to offer new understandings of the informal economy that do not call kind of repressive forms of formalization or criminalization of informal workers. And it is really interesting to say here, of course, within the context of a conversation with Thai colleagues and colleagues in the Southeast Asian region, because South Asia has a very healthy relationship with informal workers, and then but it's also every now and then turns into questions again of criminality or criminalization and forceful formalization, and they do have a huge amount of social disruption, as well as the killing of localized economies that are very important to maintain life. So the importance of representation cannot be underestimated.
Okay, thank you so much. I've been asked to now wind this up. I want to thank all of you for your incredibly insightful inputs, and also to the policy participants for some wonderful questions. We managed to get most, but hopefully we'll get other opportunities. I don't know whether I have time for any, I mean, it's such a rich debate that it's not easy for me to just settle on some takeaways. Do I have a couple of minutes, David, or would you like to sort of now wind this up?
I think if you could give a couple of takeaways, and I thought it was a very rich discussion, and had a couple of takeaways myself, and then we will need to close.
Fantastic. I'll be quick, and I'm likely to miss on some, but I think very broadly speaking, there was some very rich contextual debate as well. I think what we've learned here is that to think upon criminal law as the exclusive or the most appropriate solution is not necessarily a good idea. I mean, the context really matters. The political economy, the history of discrimination, institutional functioning is incredibly important. And we've seen several examples of how well-intended sort of policy interventions or legal interventions actually had a lot of negative consequences and enhanced and increased vulnerability. And that therefore becomes incredibly important. Who are we doing it for? And whether we're really making that person the prime sort of target of that intervention. How do we visualize criminals and how do we visualize victims becomes incredibly important, because how we frame and structure it is going to have huge ramifications as to how we come up with policy prescriptions. Obviously, if the policy prescriptions are going to be not very dynamic and they're going to be very top down, the chances are that the structural discrimination, the structural exploitation which already exists is only going to get perpetuated. We saw how a lot of the laws which were sort of introduced in various contexts actually turned up getting abused to the detriment of various people. Another very important factor is that it's important to recognize law as a terrain of contestation. People come to it with different agendas, and it would be naive not to try and imagine who's doing what and what's happening. Important points in the context of the global South, how the economic dimension of things to ensure that people do not fall into a vicious circle of violence. It's important to have that economic dimension, both in terms of understanding how laws have economic consequences, but also to make economic injections an important part of how do you fight crime and to rescue people from that entire situation. We spoke about decriminalization as well as a desirable strategy to pursue, but obviously if decriminalization is going to be operated by the same people who operate criminalization, you're not going to get much out of it. Different political approaches like or ideological approaches like the feminist legal theory people, that example I thought was incredibly fruitful to see how what you envision doing may turn out to be very different. And so multiple disciplinary outlooks, factors, and facets need to be looked at. There's a lot more to say about the carceral system and various other specific things, but I'll stop here.
Sama, thank you very much, and thanks to all of our panelists for what was a really rich discussion this time. I came away with many of the same takeaways you did, Osama. So I'd say maybe three. So for me, first, the big takeaway was the limits of criminal justice as a tool for broader social objectives. Indeed, the number of situations that all our panelists referred to in which criminal law enforcement may make things worse, even if it seems like a good idea. And that leads to the structural question that came up in the Q&A. We need to remember that criminal law is not alone, it's situated in other legal arrangements. So criminal law reform might mean doing something in what seems a very unrelated area of law. Aya and Libby both stressed, for example, the impact of criminalization as it intersects with family law or child protective services and so forth. I think my second big takeaway is a very familiar and old insight that it bears repeating, which is the differential face of criminal law, of policing and adjudication in marginal settings, which are often the focal point for criminal justice reform. So just like other areas of law, the way law looks in the books or the way we imagine it when we're doing a reform project can be quite different from the way it actually plays out. The culture of the police and courts matter, and the culture of the space into which they're intervening matters and may completely confound what it is that one is trying to do. So criminal justice reform is not just a statutory matter, it's also a matter of that requires deep cultural sensitivity, engagement, and sociological information. And I guess that my third takeaway, and maybe this is the political economy dimension that some of our participants raised, is simply the cost of criminal law intensification. So I know, Osama, you studied the administration of criminal justice in Pakistan and using a very empirical approach to understand how courts distributed access to justice. I'm reminded of the effort to defeat corruption through intensive criminalization, which I've worked on, that it might turn out that getting the criminal justice system capable of ending corruption costs more than the corruption itself does from a development point of view. It may be that an extensive but under-resourced court and police system may be more harmful than having a less extensive administrative apparatus.
Yeah.
Or Luis reminded us just finally that prisons are expensive. So an under-resourced prison may be worse than no prison. And that, especially in the context of the Global South, trying to figure out what criminal justice reform means when translated into under-resourced institutions is something that reformers who are often situated in a wealthier center of the society need to keep in mind. So it was a very rich conversation. Osama, I want to thank you for being a wise chair. I want to thank the TIJ for bringing us all together again, and thank all of you for bearing with us. I look forward to the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys, for all the panelists, Luis, Libby, Aya, for this fruitful discussion and insightful responses today. And very big thanks to Osama for a wonderful moderation and the Q&A arrangement. Last but not
Thank
least,
you so much.
David, for the closing comments that always, simplify and conclude today's discussion. So before we end today's program, please return the evaluation form that you will be receiving through Zoom chat and through email later on. Your feedback is very, very important for our program development. And the next session is scheduled on Wednesday, the 24th of February, on the topic of social justice, poverty, and inequality. So for tonight, thank you for joining us today, and see you again next time.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.